President Obama makes his own pivot to Asia. And what to do about a world that's getting older by the day. Next on The Line. This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. President Barack Obama travels to Asia this weekend, visiting Thailand and Cambodia, and most notably Burma, which has seen a dramatic opening to the West over the last year. What will be on the president's diplomatic agenda, and how will it affect the U.S. foreign policy pivot to focus on issues in Asia? I'll ask my guest, Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for the Reuters News Service. Jeff, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Eric. My pleasure.
So it's been just a little over a week since President Barack Obama was reelected for his second term, and one of the first things he does, even though the U.S. is facing domestic fiscal problems that are rather dramatic, is he announces this trip to Asia, right, and in very short order goes to Asia. How significant is the timing of this trip and right after the election?
Well, it's significant in several ways. In one way, it's significant because it does show an emphasis in terms of foreign policy about what he wants to do and the area of the world that he really wants to focus on, or at least one of them in the second part of his term in office. It also shows that he wants to use some of the strength that he now has as a two-term president in the foreign policy arena. And so going to Asia, going to those three countries that you just mentioned, he is a strengthened president. He will be a strengthened president at the summits there. He will be a strengthened president in his negotiations and discussions with leaders. So it shows a lot of priorities, and it also shows that he's ready to sort of kick off in that area for his second term.
Now, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has been traveling so extensively.
Right.
Is this an effort by the president to say that he's going to be the face of U.S. diplomacy now instead of Secretary of State?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think the White House has been very, very pleased with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and they know that she's going to step down at the end of this term. And in fact, I think on this trip there will be some speculation in the hallways and the negotiating tables that the president is at about who he will choose to replace her. But I think in general he's been very pleased with her being the face of the administration's foreign policy, particularly because the president has had to focus so much on the domestic issues in this country, in addition to his own election in the last year. So I wouldn't read this as a signal to say it's time for me to take over.
Now, of course, the most interesting, perhaps, part of this trip is the president's visit to Burma, also
Yes.
known as Myanmar. And this is after an opening to the West, but traditionally you've seen much less rapid response to opening from rogue regimes. In the past, it might be years and years before a president might visit a country that has kind of turned around toward the West. Why such a rapid pace of embracing Burma at this point?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's a question that a lot of leaders and a lot of analysts are probably asking. One, I think the administration sees this as a success story, and even though we're at the very end of the president's first term and beginning of his second term, the White House is beginning to think about legacy, and this will be one of them, his success in having helped Burma to open up. So going there and having him actually show up there is part of that in securing his own legacy. I think they also see it as an opportunity to advance the progress that has been made. The Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, obviously has already made a trip to Burma. Having the president go shows how serious the United States is about that relationship, and is a signal that they hope to show to encourage the generals to move even further. There are some risks, however.
What are those risks?
Well, some of the risks are you go there and perhaps it is going too far. Perhaps it is suggesting that these generals have moved even further than they actually have. Some analysts that I've been speaking to ahead of the trip said it could also discourage some of the civil groups, civil society groups in Burma who want to continue continue to have some leverage and want to continue to be able to put pressure on the regime. So that's something that the president and his team will no doubt have to keep in the back of their minds while they're there. Not to go too far in praising the generals, to continue to keep some pressure up, but also use the trip as an opportunity to say, well done and keep going.
Now, of course, Burma used to have China as one of its only friends.
Right.
And the U.S. now engaging with Burma. Where does that fit in this sort of broader strategy that the White House has of having a presence in the region that counterbalances the presence of China?
Yeah, well, it definitely fits into that. It's very important to the United States to have that counterbalance. What I've heard, again, from some of these analysts who I spoke to is from the Burmese side, it's not so much a desire to side with the United States now instead of China. They're just genuinely interested in improving their economy and getting this economy that has absolutely gone to the tanks in the last few decades under this dictatorship to restart again. And so they see the United States as a partner who can help them with that. And that's a lot of the motivation behind improving this relationship between both sides.
Now, the U.S., as it's reaching out to various countries in the region, seen as having a sort of effort to counterbalance against China, how is China viewing the U.S. pivot to Asia? I
think, it seems like China has been wary of it and also feels like it's seen some mixed signals from the United States. China sees the Obama White House wanting to reach out. Vice President Biden went to China over a year ago to meet with the presumed new leader, and he ended up coming earlier this year as well. But there haven't been a whole lot of contacts in terms of summits since then, and this was sort of an interesting year in the U.S.-Chinese relationship because both sides were very focused on their own internal politics. The United States had its election. The Chinese are also having a very major leadership transition. So there will be an interesting dynamic with this trip that the president is taking now in terms of how that advances or affects that relationship.
And in the White House, are people thinking about how they make this pivot to Asia without raising tensions with China, without creating an impression that this is sort of looking at China as an adversary as opposed to a partner of some sort?
Yeah, it's definitely a delicate balance, and the White House is super aware of that. They want very much for China to be seen and to be a partner. Both the United States and China need each other, both for the economy, because our economies are so intertwined, and also for foreign policy. But the United States also wants to send a signal, and this administration wants to send a signal that it is a Pacific power. And so both of those elements are very key in how they deal with China and how they deal with Beijing.
How is this seen, and how does the White House want it to be seen in the rest of the world, places where the U.S. has had such a great focus over the last decade or more in the Middle East? Now the U.S. looking more toward Asia. Are they trying to give the impression that a focus on Asia means less focus in other regions, or do they want to maintain that the focus is still the same everywhere else?
The latter. They obviously want to give this attention to Asia, and they've used the term pivot, but they don't want U.S.-European relations, for example, or the U.S. relations with other parts of the world to go down. They want to give the impression that we can do it all. We're just putting a little bit more focus right now on this particular region. But I think you can expect to see a lot of foreign travel by this president in the second term. That's something that happens traditionally in second terms of incumbent presidents, and no doubt it will not just be Asia that he ends up visiting.
Well, and especially if a president has domestic difficulties when you're abroad.
Sure.
You don't have quite the same, sort of pesky relations with your domestic opponents.
Right, and that is sort of another interesting interesting undercurrent to this trip. He is leaving at a time when there are very intense negotiations beginning between the White House and Congress about the so-called fiscal cliff. And that is also an issue that is likely to, if not come up, at least be in the background of his talks with Asian leaders, because it really affects the image of the United States from foreign countries. Will the U.S. fix its fiscal problems? Will the U.S. face another recession if it doesn't? These are issues that really affect the power of the U.S., whether it remains the superpower that it is, and whether, in fact, it can be that counterbalance to China that we were talking about earlier.
We only have a few moments left, but what about does the White House want other countries in other regions of the world that may be, difficult spots to be looking at the U.S. and how it is moving quickly in changing its relationship with Burma, and saying, look, here's an example, which is if you're willing to turn to the West, there are quick rewards to be had? I
think that's a great question. I mean, they haven't come out and said as much, but it's easy to assume that everything the White House does is watched. Everything President Obama does in terms of his schedule, in terms of what he says, in terms of where he says it, is watched. And they see that absolutely as an example. And I think that they would like to have that as a pinpoint or a way to go with some of the other hotspots in this world.
Jeff Mason is White House correspondent for Reuters. Thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. The world's population is aging, with more and more people living into their 60s and beyond. According to a recent United Nations report, 1 in 9 people around the world are now 60 years old or more. By the year 2050, 1 in 5 people are expected to be over 60. What are the issues and challenges aging populations bring? And how are societies likely to change as their people get older? To find out, I sat down with Nicholas Eberstadt, a demographer and scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. I asked him why populations are aging.
There are 2 reasons that populations are aging. The main reason is kind of a surprise. It makes sense when you hear that life expectancy is increasing. That's happening almost everywhere in the world, with a few sad exceptions. And increase in life expectancy is part of the dynamic, but a very small part of the dynamic. What's really making populations grayer, strangely enough, is smaller family size. It's fewer kids rather than longer lives that are really driving the graying we're seeing around the world. And it's counterintuitive, but you can kind of make sense of it if you think of an old-fashioned population pyramid looking like that. You squeeze the base with fewer kids, and a higher share of the top is going to be made up of people over the age of 60 or 65.
Well, in a lot of the countries, the lower fertility rates, fewer numbers of children being born is tied in with economic trends, but then they have economic impact themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, the really surprising thing is how far the march towards smaller family size has gone in low-income countries already. I mean, we think of richer countries as having small families, and almost all affluent countries have fewer than 2.1 children per woman per lifetime, that being the sort of magical number required for long-term stability without immigration.
This being an average, there isn't anyone having 0.1 children.
The 0.1 child is hard to find, yes, but it's on average just a little bit over 2 kids. What you've seen in the developing areas over the last half a century is a really radical drop in childbearing, a drop of, I think, over 50% in total children per woman per lifetime on average. And now we're at a situation in the world where about half of the people living on Earth live in countries where childbearing is at or actually below the replacement level. And most of these are low-income developing societies. So this is what's bringing about a big change in population aging in lower income areas today, and with a lot of momentum for the future, which of course is going to have big economic implications.
Well, what are the economic implications when you have a society where there's a larger and larger percentage of the population that is 60 years old and older?
Well, if it's being driven by below replacement fertility, and if you don't have compensating immigration from abroad coming to balance that out, three things happen. The first one is that the working age population, as usually defined, rises, peaks, and then begins a more or less indefinite decline. A few years later, the same thing happens to human numbers. And then, of course, all the while, you've got a grayer and grayer population profile. Living longer is a great blessing.
It can be looked at, the aging of populations is in a way a tremendous success story.
It's absolutely a success story. And for the globe as a whole, the reason that we had a population explosion was not because people suddenly started breeding like rabbits, it's because they stopped dying like flies. It was 100%, actually it was more than 100% driven by improvements in health. And improvements in health are good for all sorts of reasons, some of them economic, but your loved ones survive, your friends survive, citizens and your compatriots survive. And all of that is, all other things being equal, very auspicious for the generation of wealth and prosperity. You can wreck it. You can have bad policies in place that thwart the potential for reaping a dividend from this, but it's a tremendous positive factor.
Now, the recent UN report on aging population said population aging presents social, economic, and cultural challenges to individuals, families, societies, and the global community. That's a pretty broad set of challenges, but what do you think are the primary and most significant challenges that come from this success story of aging populations?
I think that there are a lot of new arrangements that haven't quite been worked through, but that will need to be worked through if we're going to deal with a world in which a much larger share of people are gray, are in their 60s and older. Generally speaking, people think of these older years of 60 or 65, something after that, as being notional ages of retirement. And if they are going to be notional ages of retirement, the whole question of how one supports a growing number of people who are retirees naturally comes to the fore. The second question, of course, has to do with health care. People who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and so forth tend to be affected by declining health status. They have higher death rates. They have more medical problems. And the whole question of how society copes with the health needs of a grayer society is a big one.
And we've seen even just in the United States in its efforts to figure out how health care will be paid for, that the issue of whether there is going to be any restriction on expensive procedures for people who are aged has been a very politically sensitive issue.
Well, the United States, in its health care debate, is an exception to the rule in the rest of the world, as the United States so often tends to be exceptional. The United States, being virtually the most affluent society history has ever seen, is less constrained by economic realities in its discussion about healthcare costs than just about any place else on earth. If you're in a low-income society, there's not going to be a discussion about unlimited supplies of healthcare. People are going to have to make very difficult choices about the sorts of systems they arrange, just because the discussion is constrained by economic exigence.
And one of the things that seems to be particularly problematic for aging populations is that populations are aging at a time when traditional societal ways of caring for parents is falling apart. I would think in China, where you've had traditionally children looking after their parents, all living together, when the younger generation moves to the city and their parents are left behind in rural villages, and then those parents are living longer lives, that this creates particular problems.
Oh, I'm really glad you mentioned that, Eric, because this change in mores and family structure and living arrangements may be the single most critical aspect of population aging burdens or population aging challenges, especially for the developing world. We've talked about the good things that come with it. This is kind of the tough side of it. We have two different sets of trends transforming families in developing areas. One, as you mentioned, is the changing obligations or loyalty or commitments of younger generations to their older members. In the good old Confucian days in Asia, it was easy to venerate older people because there weren't too many of them. What do you do when there are many more older people than children? How does that affect one's attitudes and mores? That's one part of the equation. But another part of the equation is that just as we saw in richer countries, now in developing countries we are increasingly seeing what might be called a flight from marriage. A breakup of the older arrangements in so many places of universal marriage norms, people postponing marriage, never getting married, getting divorced, not having kids, the upshot of which is going to be that the family structure that older people are going to have to rely upon is going to be a lot more frayed than it was for their parents or their grandparents. And what picks up the slack is as yet an unanswered question.
Well, Nicholas Eberstadt, demographer, a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Eric. Always good to be here.
Before we go, I'd like to invite you to send us your questions or comments. You can reach us through our website at voanews.com/ontheline. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you'll join us again next week for On the Line.
Create games.
Create learning.
Create global understanding. And win $5,000.
Create UNAOC 2012.
It's a worldwide contest for app and game developers.
The United Nations Alliance of Civilizations and the Voice of America want you to put your talent to use.
The world needs your app. Create UNAOC 2012. What can you contribute to the global conversation?
5 finalists, ages 13 or older.
Each win $5,000 to develop a fully functional app or game.
Create UNAOC 2012.
Your learning app or game can go global. Go to unaoc.org/create.
People plus knowledge equals global understanding.